Okay, so welcome everyone to this webinar. My name first is John Sanchez. I'm a professor of applied economics at the University of Valencia, and I'm currently the president of the European Wartime Network. First, let me give you a couple of words on what is the European Wartime Network and what we do. And afterwards, I will introduce the webinar that we have for today and our speakers. Okay, so the European Wartime Network is a European organization that advocates for work time reduction policies as a means to achieve more sustainable forms of production, more meaningful jobs, and a fair distribution of wealth. Our members include a variety of organizations. We have, for instance, trade unions, we have NGOs, we have citizen movements, we have academics, we have policymakers. So everyone is welcome to join our organization and to work with us in the pursuit of shorter working hours across Europe. Throughout the year, we organize different activities. For instance, this series of webinars that you are attending now. We also have a regular newsletter that I would advise you to join if you have not already, because you can follow the different updates that we have on work time reduction policies across Europe. So that's very interesting. And we also hold each year an in-person annual event and conference that this year it's going to be held in Porto with the collaboration of the University of Porto, sorry. So check that out in case you have missed it, because it's an interesting conference, and you can also present papers and everything there. So please check that out if you are interested in coming to this event in September in Porto, in Portugal. Moreover, of course, if you are interested to join the European Work Time Network, please check our website, reach to any of us, and we will be delighted to have you on board and to collaborate with us. So after having said that about our organization, let's move to the webinar that we have for today. As you know, this year 2026, it marks the 100-year anniversary of the introduction of the 40-hour week by Henry Ford in its Detroit plant in the US in 1926. This was an important historical moment, and as I'm sure both of the speakers will remark, because this move established the modern international standard for the work week as we know it today, even if some countries such as Spain or even the UK had already introduced the 8-hour day legislation before that. But the 5-day, 4-day hour work week standard, as we know it, we can trace it back to Henry Ford. So that's an interesting fact that it's worth exploring in today's slide. So we thought that this year would be a good opportunity to reflect on this event. Also, other organizations are hosting a variety of events to celebrate this moment and to ignite this debate about work time reduction that we are trying to push forward. So what we want to do in this webinar today is, have a bit of historical memory, of course, but also try to read what is happening today in light of Ford's learnings. So that's what we are going to try to do in this webinar. And to do that, we have two wonderful speakers. Each of us will speak for around 15 minutes. And afterwards, we will have plenty of time for questions. Okay, so that's a bit the structure and the reason that gathers us today in this webinar. So for speakers, we have, as I mentioned, two persons that are deeply involved in the 40 week movement and who have a very good knowledge of the history of work time reduction. So I'm sure both are going to be amazing and very interesting presentations. First, we have Tatiana Pignon, who is an associate director at the Autonomy Institute, where she coordinates research and consultancy projects on working time reduction and other progressive workplace policies. Prior to joining Autonomy, Tatiana has a lot of experience in the field. She has served as a political advisor in France, and she also holds a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She has been also a lead author of on some of the autonomy projects related to the 4-day week, for instance, the follow-up of the 4-day week trial, and also the assessment of the Scottish public sector 4-day week trial. So she's going to speak a bit about the historical perspective and also to what's different in Europe, because of course the experience of Henry Ford was in the US, which, as you know, it's a different setting in terms of work time regulation and management practices. So that will be the topic that she will be mostly going into. After that, we will have Joe Riley, who is the director of the 4-day week Foundation, which is the successor, let's say, of the 4-day week campaign, which has been an organization very influential in the 4-day week debate and in the 4-day week movement. He's the author also of a book about the 4-day week. It's called the 4-day week Handbook by Canterbury Press, published in 2024. And as Tatiana, he also worked a lot in policy and in the field, let's say, and he was a former advisor to John McDonnell, the former well, he was a former advisor to the Labour MP John McDonnell. Okay, so these are our two speakers and some words about their profiles. Okay. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Tatiana to do her presentation. And after that, we'll move to Joe and to questions. So Tatiana, whenever you want, go ahead.
Thanks, Johan. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. I hope this is coming up okay. Hi, everyone. It's great to see many of you again and meet new ones. Very happy to be here today. So yeah, as John said, I'll be using my time today to offer a brief historical perspective on the 5-day week and working time reduction with a focus on Europe. And then Joe will say a bit more about where we're at today. So the first thing to say is that, as John said in his introduction, why we're celebrating 100 years of the 5-day week today in 2026 is because we're celebrating a single decision by a single man, really, Henry Ford in 1926, who gave his 55,000 workers at the Ford Motor Company a 2-day weekend a century ago with a working week of 40 hours. And this decision is why he's sometimes credited today with either inventing the weekend or giving us all a 5-day week. So just to bring a little bit of nuance to that narrative, even though this is indeed an important moment in the history of work time reduction, I think it's fair to ask whether we're not giving Ford a bit too much credit when it comes to actually inventing the 5-day week. So first of all, it's important to remember that Ford did not actually invent the idea. The idea of a weekly period of respite from work is obviously age-old, and in Europe in particular, there was a tradition that goes back to kind of the Middle Ages, where workers would voluntarily decide to not work on a Monday. It was called Saint Monday. It was practiced widely across many European countries for centuries. And it was then progressively replaced with Sunday rest, guaranteed by law in many countries at different points in time. In the UK, for example, this was done with the Parliament Act as early as 1677. So something that was enshrined in law in a long time ago already. But in the context of the Industrial Revolution, where we're starting our story here, there were also people before Ford who advocated for an extended period of weekly rest of more than just 1 day per week. In particular, there's an industrialist and worker activist called Robert Laws from the Greater Manchester area, who is credited with first advocating for mill workers to be given Saturday afternoons off in 1843, in addition to Sunday. And there is actually an annual festival in Manchester, which I believe this year's edition is taking place next week, actually. That's called We Invented the Weekend, that celebrates Law's fight for leisure time to this day. So there are many people who are actually claiming inventing the weekend in this sense. But even in the United States, if we're looking at the United States, Ford was not the first to implement a 5-day week either. There was a cotton mill in New England that gave its workers a 2-day weekend as early as 1908, so 18 years before. The reason was actually to accommodate its mostly Jewish workforce who had been asking for Saturdays off. And that was actually a Sabbatarian movement, so asking for having a Saturday off in addition to the Sunday, that was quite prominent in the United States at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century. And finally, and this is also important, the Ford Motor Company was a huge company, and it also established a standard in its industry that was then followed by some of Ford's rival, but it employed at the time 55,000 workers, as I said, and that's out of a total workforce in the United States of 45 million workers, according to estimates from the Federal Reserve economic data. So it is also important to keep in mind that it would take 12 more years before the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 would actually embed the 40-hour work week in federal law for all workers in the United States, and not just those who were working in this industry. So Ford's decision was definitely a bold move for the time, and as I said, it had repercussions beyond its own company. But ultimately, the reduction in the working week wasn't the work of leading business owners or economic magnates. It was really the result of sustained efforts and struggle from the organized labor movement. And that was especially true in Europe, where we can actually question whether Ford's decision was influential at all. So let's have now a closer look at the history of working time reduction in Europe. You see here on the slide, and sorry because the quality is not very good of the image, but it's a reproduction of a poster for the implementation of the 8-hour workday. It's in French, but it translates as "when the 8th hour rings, no one should remain in the workshop." And indeed, the primary demand of the labor movement when it came to working time was not ultimately about the weekend. Originally, it was about limiting the length of the workday. This was a response to new forms of work that were brought about by the Industrial Revolution, seen as more exploitative, more alienating than ever before due to standardization, to increased division of labor, to strict employer control in many factories, and increasingly also to the impact of automation, which changed the ways in which work was organized and also created important work intensification and longer hours. So in 1866, the International Association of Workers, which you will know as the First International, adopted the 8-hour day as one of its key demands. And following that, workers' association and trade unions across Europe, who weren't already, would then campaign for the 8-hour day for half a century. Successfully in the end, because the 8-hour day was won in most European countries just after World War I. So the first country to implement it in Europe was Bolshevik Russia just after the October Revolution, but it was closely followed soon after by Finland, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Poland, Austria, Denmark, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, and then a few years later, Belgium and Italy as well. And in the majority of these countries, the 8-hour day was passed into law following important strikes. So long-standing campaigns, but also important strikes that took place right after the First World War. For example, in Spain, there was a huge strike of 100,000 workers who went on strike for 44 days in Catalonia. And that's what led the Spanish government to implement the 8-hour workday. At that time, however, as we said before, the working week was 6 days long with only 1 day of rest, meaning that the working week was then 48 hours long with an 8-hour day. So the next step was to win a 40-hour working week over 5 days, effectively bringing down the length of the working week and thus securing the weekend as we know it. This took quite a long time, however. So as I said, it had taken about half a century to win the 8-hour workday in Europe. And if we take the 1920s now as our starting point for the campaign for the 40-hour working week, it's then about half a century as well before it becomes the norm for most European workers. So they were early wins, particularly in the Soviet Union, again, which passed a decree at the end of the 1920s, in France, where the Popular Front government passed the 40-hour work week in 1936, again following a massive strike movement. In Italy, where Mussolini's fascist government actually implemented some social policies in the 20s and 30s, including the 40-hour work week, before revoking it a few years later to support the war effort. And in 1935, the International Labour Organization, that had been created a few years before, adopted a convention that recognized the principle of the 40-hour working week, but few countries signed it at the time. The war changed things, and working time went up to support the war effort, and just after the war, also the reconstruction, and really across all countries. So it's then only in the 1950s that the 40-hour work week came back on the agenda in a prominent way, with trade unions making it their flagship demands, for example, in Germany, where unions demonstrated on the 1st of May, Labor Day, 1952, for the 40-hour work week. You see on the slide here an illustration taken from a campaign by the Confederation of German Trade Unions, DGB, in 1955. The slogan reads, Samstags gehört Vati mir, which means on Saturday, Daddy belongs to me. And so that campaign was quite successful and managed to mobilize a lot of workers, but it was only progressively that the 40-hour work week was then secured in Germany. Ultimately, this was done in the late 60s through collective bargaining rather than law. And in fact, it's really only in the 60s and even the 70s that the 40-hour work week progressively becomes the norm for all workers in most European countries. Even in France, where it had been guaranteed by law since 1936, as I said, it's only after the general strike and the social movement of May 68 that it becomes effectively implemented and actually respected across the economy. In some countries or parts of the economy, the trend of working time reduction also continued beyond this. So we have prominent examples like IG Metall's campaign for a 35-hour work week in Germany and the huge strikes of 1984, or France's 35-hour work week law that was passed by the Socialist Party in 2000. And it's worth noting here, just as a quick aside, that the law and culture around working time still differ quite a bit between European countries. Currently, the European regulation defines the maximum working week as 48 hours. So the 40-hour work week is not enshrined in European regulations. However, legal frameworks and implementation vary greatly between different countries. So just as an example, the United Kingdom, for example, never formally secured in law a 40-hour work week, but the average work week in the UK today is about 36.5 hours. Similarly, in the Netherlands, it's the same in terms of law, but there is a very strong part-time culture and high protections afforded to part-time workers, which means that the average work week across the economy is 32 hours. In contrast, in France, where you have a legal 35-hour work week, the actual working time is 37 hours per week on average, if you're taking into account part-time work as well. So alongside the struggle for limiting working time and essentially putting a cap on the greed of capitalists when it came to exploiting workers' time, there was also a positive demand, and of course the two are linked, but also a positive demand that was articulated for free time over the course of the 20th century. So the right to a minimum amount of paid annual leave, or right to holidays, which is what the banner here says in French, was won early on in just a few European countries, very few, in 1919 in Austria with the Workers' Leave Act, in 1936 in France with the Popular Front, and in Belgium as well, and in 1938 in the UK with the Holidays with Pay Act. But it's only, again, after the war that the right to annual leave paid by the employer became generalized in Europe. And ultimately, it's only in the 70s and 80s that the paid leave allowances were extended to what we know today. So from 1 or 2 weeks of leave originally to 4 or 5. And today, the minimum amount of guaranteed paid leave within the European Union is 20 days or 4 weeks per year, based on the idea of the 5-day week. That, again, was the result of longstanding campaigns by trade unions and workers' associations. So having said all that, one last thing that I wanted to mention is what were the reasons leading to working time reduction, depending also on who was leading it. So if we go back to Ford's decision to reduce the working week for his workers in 1926 in the United States, there were a few reasons behind it that he articulated at the time. Ford aimed to increase productivity at work, believing, and he was right, as we see today with evaluations of shorter working week trials in many countries, that better rested and happier workers would be more productive. This was verified. He also was aiming to enable his workers to be consumers at the weekend. Ford believed that mass consumption was essential to economic growth, and so therefore leisure time for workers was necessary so as to enable this mass consumption. So it's this idea that his workers should be able to buy and use the cars that they were producing. And finally, and this is sometimes looked over a little bit, but he was trying to attract and retain workers within the Ford Motor Company, despite the fact that jobs were tedious and quite arduous on his assembly lines. And in 1914 already, Henry Ford had introduced within his company an 8-hour day before any regulation around it, and doubled the minimum wage in an effort to attract workers and limit the quite heavy turnover that he was seeing within his company. In contrast with this, here are the main reasons that were articulated by the labor movement when advocating for the 8-hour day or the 40-hour week. The first one was improving working conditions and protecting workers' physical and mental health. Interesting here as well to note that the concern with mental health is not that new, because you see in campaigning materials at the turn of the 19th century already reflections on how intensified work, automation, long hours, etc., are impacting mental and psychosocial health for workers. The second key argument mobilized by unions throughout the century really was around unemployment. So combating unemployment seen as a plague and advocating for working time reduction as a way to distribute work more equally, taking into account the fact that work is the condition for access to basic rights and means of survival. So as a way to kind of reduce inequality and unfairness within society. And finally, but also no less important, consistent claims around free time and leisure time as an end in itself, as something that is valuable in itself, affording value to other human activities outside of paid work. And for example, there's a flyer by the French CGT, so a leading trade union in 1906, that says that workers, like all humans, need to be able to think, to grow, to learn, to love. And that's why working time reduction is necessary. So a fight for free time here as a fight for freedom and for the right of all to pursue happiness, ultimately. So interesting to think in mind as well when we're advocating for working time reduction today, to ask what aims this is serving and what conditions are necessary in order for it to be available to all. So in very brief conclusion, the demand for limitation on working time, whether the 8-hour day or the 40-hour week or further, and the demand for free time, protected free time outside of work in the form of paid leave or the weekend, have been central in the labor movement since the Industrial Revolution. And while business leaders may help to set new standards, ultimately this shows that lasting wins are built on union campaigns and social movements and national legislation or protections that ensure it, again, as a right available to all and not just an instrumental way of making one company more successful. And just to leave you with some other anniversaries also that we could keep in mind in 2026 if we are celebrating historical wins. 1926 was, for example, the last general strike in Britain, unfortunately unsuccessful. But in 1936, we had strikes of joy in France that then led to the Popular Front implementing a 40-hour work week and first paid leave. In 1946, the International Labour Organization became the first specialized agency of the newly created United Nations. In 1956, IG Metall had huge wins in Germany. So there are a few other anniversaries that we can also include in our celebration of working time reduction progress in Europe as well. I will end here. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, so thank you very much, Tatiana, for your wonderful presentation. Really interesting historical perspective. So we move on now to Joe. The floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me all right now? Yeah, great. I just had to turn the fan off. It's probably the first time I've spoken at a European event where it's actually hotter in England than anywhere else. Just had to turn it. I've got a big fan planted next to me here, so I just had to turn it off so I can hear everything. But yeah, nice to see you all. I'm Joe Ryle, the campaign director for the 4-Day Week Foundation. And we've actually been marking this 100-year anniversary that we just heard about from Tatiana. And one of the things that I think strikes me as someone campaigning for a 4-day working week today, when we think about this anniversary, I guess one of the main things that strikes me is that some of the arguments that were made at the time that a kind of 5-day working week became normalized before everyone was working 6 days a week. Some of the arguments that, well, pretty much all the arguments that were made against the 5-day working week then are being made again now against the 4-day working week. So this is things like the economy will suffer, productivity will collapse, workers won't be able to adapt. All these kind of arguments that we're hearing today against the kind of 4-day, 32-hour working week or a shorter working week, however you want to define it, are exact same arguments being made 100 years ago. And I think that's interesting. And I think for us, what we've been trying to do at the 4-Day Week Foundation in the UK is use the anniversary to remind people how long it has been that we've had this kind of 5-day working week, and that now is essentially the time for change. We were out at Ford Motor Company's Dagenham HQ in just outside London a couple of weeks ago on the 1st of May anniversary with our kind of banners, holding up the banners saying, now it's time for a 4-day working week. We've also been supporting the BBC with a documentary that has just come out this week, actually. I'd recommend listening to it. They've got a documentary out every day this week marking the anniversary and talking about 4-day working week, and also holding events with workers, trade unionists. And I don't know if you saw it, we also filmed the fun I actually got in a 1926 Ford T model car to film our kind of campaign video. It's worth a watch, quite good fun. And I guess where that leads us, if we think back to 100 years ago, and obviously we're a campaign based in the UK, but there'll be similar stories elsewhere across Europe. Essentially, working hours have not significantly reduced, at least since the 1980s. There was a gradual reduction of hours in the UK anyway, but since the 1980s, essentially we're working almost exactly the same working hours as we were in the 1980s. Now, from our perspective, we think that is utterly ridiculous. If you think about all of the productivity, technological gains we've had in the economy over the last few decades, none of that really has gone to workers in the form of more free time. And that historical link between greater productivity and less hours work, because if we can all be more productive, then we surely don't need to be working as much. That historical link has been broken, and that is fundamentally what we think needs to change. And so all these arguments that we heard 100 years ago against the 5-day working week are being made again today. They were wrong then, and they're wrong again now. And I'll just outline some of the kind of research that we've seen published across Europe and the UK, wider across the world over the last few years, which kind of proves this basically. We were part of working alongside the Autonomy Institute, part of running the world's biggest ever trial of a 4-day working week in 2022, with 61 companies took part. I think one of the most exciting things about that pilot was a real range of companies from different sectors of the economy. It wasn't just marketing companies. There was finance companies, there was retail organizations, manufacturing, hospitality, a real mix. And everyone was kind of implementing it slightly different to meet their context. But essentially, it was a reduction of hours with people working a 4-day working week and no loss of pay. And I guess it's worth saying that not everyone on that trial had Friday off. There was different variations of days off. Some people were kind of working Wednesdays off or Mondays off. There was real variations in the way it was implemented. But fundamentally, it was a 4-day week, no loss of pay. And the results were pretty outstanding, really. We didn't know what was going to happen. It was a bit of a gamble. It was a genuine experiment, and we had researchers on the project, including Autonomy and Juliet Shaw in Boston College. And the results were amazing, really, from both the employers and the workers' side, which is one of our main kind of arguments now for a 4-day week, is that it can, when implemented correctly, it can be a win-win for both the worker and the employer. And so on the workers' side, firstly, we saw huge reductions in burnout. I think there was a 70% reduction in burnout for workers. Work-life balance significantly improved. There was a sleep improved for people taking part on it. People were much happier. People were reporting they're just much more satisfied with their life. And then on the employer side, everyone can sort of understand how a worker working one less day a week is going to be better rested, have better well-being, be a happier worker. It's less easy to understand how, from a company perspective, it kind of works. Because, on the face of it, it does seem counterintuitive that working less hours or less days would produce better results. But that was what we found, and that is what all the research is now pointing to. When you have better rested workers, when you have but workers that aren't burnt out, stressed, working all the time, they tend to bring a better version of themselves to work. When you come back in on a Monday morning, you've had that 3-day weekend, you're much more refreshed, you're much more energized, you're much more motivated. And all the research is now pointing towards this, alongside all the kind of physical and mental health benefits. The other part of it, which I think is important to outline, is it's not just about, I think this is one of the things I've learned over the last few years, it's not just about doing everything you were doing before in 5 days in 4. You also have to think about redesigning work and refocusing your work, because there's too much time spent in definitely in the British economy, but I'm sure across Europe, there's too much presenteeism. People are at work, but what are they actually doing? Are they actually contributing to what you want to achieve? And the organisations that I would say have had the most success with a 4-day working week so far are those ones that have really focused on work redesign. How do we focus our time, our 4 days, on exactly what we want to achieve as an organisation? How do we bring on board staff along the way? And that can be quite an empowering process. So that was the kind of world's biggest trial in 2022, but there's been so many other trials now all across the world, from Australia to Spain to Portugal to America, Ireland, so many countries, and some of these have been government led as well. In Portugal, in Scotland, in Iceland, and what they're all pointing to is this kind of phenomenal results. Really, I mean, the workers much happier, much better rested, and then the companies performing just as well as they were before, if not better. And obviously, there's a long way to go in terms of how we roll this out much more widely, but the kind of initial evidence is very encouraging. And all those trials that I've mentioned so far have been in the kind of in the private sector primarily. So this is interesting, something which is kind of being led by the private sector. And I guess if you think back to the influence that Ford had 100 years ago when they made that big decision, we're very aware that if we can get another big company of that size today to implement a 4-day working week, that you probably would see a ripple effect quite quickly across Europe. So that's definitely one thing we've been thinking about and working on. But there has been many trials in the well, not so many, but a decent number of trials in the public sector now too, from Iceland to the Scottish government to the first local council in the UK that have adopted a 4-day working week. And again, the results of all of these trials have been pretty similar to what we found in the private sector. The only difference I'd say is that maybe the reasoning for moving to a 4-day working week has been different in some of those spaces. For example, in Cambridge, in England, where we have the first council now who have not only trialled a 4-day week for 2 years, but have now permanently adopted it. Their challenge was around job retention, job recruitment, and they were spending £2 million a year on kind of agency fees to bring in staff. And they've actually been able to save taxpayers money by just having the 4-day week, because it's much more attractive to staff. They're able to recruit for jobs that they couldn't recruit for many years. And that's been another advantage that we've seen. And there's so many benefits to a 4-day working week. Whether you think about workers, employers, you think about climate, at this moment we're in this heat wave, we do need to be commuting less. We need to be living more sustainably, and to live more sustainably, we need to have more time to, be able to live and engage with more kind of environmentally sustainable behaviors. So climate is another reason why we definitely need a 4-day working week. I've talked already about physical and mental health. I don't know if people saw, but there was a research paper out last week about the impact it could have on obesity levels, because when people have less working time, they have more time to spend doing exercise, taking healthier life choices potentially. So really, really exciting to think about what a 4-day week could do for society, if this was implemented much more widely. And obviously we've got a long way to go. In the UK, we're quite excited that we now have kind of from our count, 600, 700 companies that have done this. We've got the first local council. And yeah, I think I just want to talk briefly before I kind of round up about how we win a 4-day working week today and what we're trying to do in the UK, because I'm interested to see if any of those lessons will apply elsewhere and to hear what questions you've got. So from our perspective, the 4-day week foundation, we sort of take a kind of bottom up and a top down approach. So to start with the kind of like top down approach, we do spend our time kind of lobbying governments, because we do think there is a role to play for governments in this. Definitely in a kind of transitionary policies to enable the economy to shift for a 4-day working week. And one of the policy demands we've been calling for a while now is for a kind of 32-hour working week that's kind of mandated across the economy. And you couldn't implement something like that overnight, but you have a period of 5 or 10 years where the economy prepares. You work sector by sector to work out how that's going to roll out. And there would be huge benefits to unemployment as well if you're talking about a 4-day week at that scale, because you start to share work more equally across the economy. And that top-down approach is needed if we think about some of the sectors where it will be harder to implement or more complex, healthcare, in education. There's lots of settings where the 4-day week isn't immediately straightforwardly obvious how you would implement it overnight. So you do need government coordination, working with trade union leaders, working with business leaders to kind of make it a reality. But from a bottom-up approach, which is equally as important, we are continuously supporting employers to implement 4-day working weeks. Most employers like to trial it first, so they'll trial it for 3 or 6 months, with 6 months being the kind of optimum amount of time. And what that does is it kind of gives anyone who's a little bit skeptical, a little bit unsure, it gives them a kind of get out clause essentially. So you can say, well, if it doesn't work out, we can always go back to working a 5-day week at the end of it. Now that never really seems to happen. Nine times or more out of 10. It works very well and kind of embeds in very nicely into that 6 months. But that is approach we've taken that I think has worked very well. A lot of organizations do trials first and then permanently implement it afterwards. We also have an accreditation scheme, so we're getting close to kind of 300 accredited employers in the UK who are kind of organizations that have got the kind of our organization badge and permanently say we do this is how we work going forwards. That has also enabled research opportunities, and I think what we've been able to do by getting enough case studies off the ground in terms of businesses that have done that is then develop the research to kind of show how it's working, best practice, and so that gives confidence to other employers and businesses. If you're a business and you're looking around you, who's your competitors, what are they doing, and you see similar organization to you, similar size, and they've offered a 4-day working week, then there's probably something you're going to have to think about, because otherwise you're going to potentially lose your best staff and not be able to compete when it comes to kind of attracting people through jobs. The final part of this which is where we're spending a lot more time more recently, is the kind of organizing side. This is again the bottom up approach. We cannot rely on bosses. In the case we saw 100 years ago of Henry IV, we cannot rely on them to just hand the workers a 4-day working week. That is probably what's happened in the last few years. The early pioneers, the kind of good bosses have been able to do it. At some point, we're going to exhaust those numbers of good bosses, and that's why we do need really strong organizing campaigns, working in partnership with trade unions. In the UK, we have about 40 active workplace campaigns now where we're supporting workers to directly organize in their workplace to win a 4-day working week. And I think we've had 6 or 7 successes so far. And that's in partnership with 2 of the kind of major trade unions. Getting towards the end now, I think I'll round up by saying the final thing we need in terms of how to win a 4-day working week is more collaboration across Europe. And I think, that's why I want to say this network, the kind of European Work Time Network, is so vital as part of that, to enable the conversation, the sharing of dialogue and information across Europe as the campaigns grow and grow, hopefully. I think, essentially our argument 100 years later, this is a very long time. The economy does not need us to be working 5 days a week anymore. There is absolutely no need for it. Businesses have shown that they can make it work in all sorts of different sectors, make the 4-day week work, and really is something which we believe is very long overdue if you think about the history of this. I'll end there and looking forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Joe. So we have around 15 minutes, a bit more, for questions. So please, if you have any question, post it in the chat or raise your hand, and you can pose it to the speakers. Okay, so anyone wants to speak, to make a question, or we have a comment in the chat, but I'm not sure if it's a question or just a comment. But any specific question that you want to?
I think it's an important question though in the chat from Christina, because I think it's important to note the distinction between a genuine reduction of working hours, 4-day working week, and a compressed hours, 4-day working week, which is a very different thing. And this is something which does get confused quite a lot, particularly by the media, and it can be frustrating, and we've been absolutely clear. A 4-day week is a reduction of hours. It's not compressing a 40-hour working week into 4 days, which in many cases is going to exacerbate a lot of the problems we've seen, that the 4-day week tries to fix.
Yeah, totally true. Good point. So we have a question, Rita.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. And thank you for the great presentation, Tatiana and Joe. So I'm also involved in this Zurich 40-week trial in the public sector. And from your experience, also maybe comparing some of the data that we have from the public sector, from Cambridge, for example, and from the private sector. What I'm feeling is that we are basically getting a lot more information on productivity measures. That's kind of one of the key questions. That what about productivity in firms? Was wondering if you do feel the same. Whether you do feel that we need those metrics to be more systematic, to actually make it more possible to reach legislation, or to at least support collective bargaining. So what's your view on that, especially when we think about the public and private sector?
Thank you, Rita.
For both of you.
Do you want me to? Yeah, I mean, I could jump in to start. I mean, I think the question of how you define productivity is quite a fascinating one, and it is one that people get very confused by. And there is no one metric for productivity. I mean, I'm often quite surprised by the number of companies I meet, who, when in a conversation about how do they define success as an organization, they often don't have any idea. When you think about KPIs, what are the key metrics that you want to achieve? I like to think of productivity more as like business performance. So that what are you trying to achieve as your business, and how are you measuring that? And it's quite baffling sometimes how many companies don't know how they're measuring success for their organization. In the case of local councils and public sector, it's a bit clearer. They do have standardized metrics across the country that are measured, on things like service delivery, how the bins, the bins are collected, and how the punctuality around things like that are measured by councils in a standardized way. But it can be sometimes tricky in the private sector to actually nail down what the metrics are. Sometimes it's just as simple as profits. Have profits been maintained, or on a 4-day week? But for others, there's others, particularly if you think about kind of charities, not for profits. There's going to be very different metrics involved.
Yeah, absolutely echoing that from our experience with companies. But I think, and to your general question of, do we need more of these metrics, basically, or are these the metrics we should be using to continue making the case? I think it's a combination, right? Because obviously, as Joe was saying, it's really useful to have this demonstrated, and to show that even if you're really playing by the rules, the economic rules that we are in currently, there is still a case that a 4-day week is maybe more rational, or a shorter working week is maybe more rational, actually, and more productive and more useful to the economy overall than longer working hours. But I think ultimately, as Joe was also saying, there is a limit to this, because it still relies on economic actors and business leaders mainly leading the game. And I think there will be a limit to this, particularly because we see most of those business owners being interested in shorter working hours as a differentiation strategy as well, particularly on the labor market. And that really raises a question to my mind in terms of equality and just the accessibility of shorter working hours to all. There are also some sectors, and I know you've worked on this particularly, Rita, that will not then be eligible to shorten working hours, because productivity or performance is directly linked to working hours. So if we're thinking about care sectors or some service sectors. And so there comes a point at which I think it should be more of a principled campaign, basically, that relates also to other sort of metrics or other sort of success evaluations as a society than just business performance. But yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so now we have 2 questions. Well, let's go first to the one in the chat, which is by Michel Cernac. He asked about the increasing attention that what he calls the fake 4-day week, which is the compressed version, let's say, of the 4-day week. He says it's a modality that is getting a lot of attention in some countries, especially by the right wing. So he asked, I imagine, how do you see this question, and if the same trend it's been observed in other countries where the compressed 4-day week is used politically in that sense for confusion purposes.
Yeah, I can quickly answer that. I mean, I think the confusion can be unhelpful, but at the same time, it is adding to a conversation which is quite big now. That Fridays, at least in the UK, Fridays aren't what they used to be. Whether people are genuinely working a 4-day week and they're off, or they're working remotely, working from home, or they're doing compressed hours, or they're doing a 9-day fortnight. Fridays aren't what they used to be, and that is helpful. That is good. That is a good thing that at a national level people are seeing that their working life is changing around them. And I think compressed hours is part of that. In the UK, what we've had is the government have strengthened the right to flexible working, and included in that is the right to request a compressed hours 4-day week. Now, it's absolutely not what we advocate for. We do want reduced hours, but at the same time, it can be a kind of first step to a genuine 4-day working week. If you're doing 4 longer days, but actually your boss isn't really that checking when you start and when you end, then you do have the possibility to do it. It's not ideal. We've been quite clear that we define it as a 32-hour working week or less. But I do think the fact that there's a much bigger conversation about flexible working at the same time is helpful. We've not had what happened in Belgium, where the government announced a kind of compressed hours 4-day week policy, and actually take up, as I understand it, was relatively low. People don't want to work 4 very long working days. They want a reduction in working hours. So the confusion can be unhelpful, but there is a wider conversation happening, which I think is positive.
Mm. Yeah, and just to add quickly to that as well, I think that's why also, historically, trade unions have been advocating for a length of the working week understood in hours, not days, because that's the only way to ensure fairness, really. I don't have the numbers for all European countries, but in countries like France or the UK, you've got 15 to 20% of the workforce that is working on weekends or at what we call irregular and social hours. So it's also not, even though it does matter, of course, what the kind of normal working week looks like, because the economy is organized around it. But it does matter as well that there are a lot of people who are still outside of this, and with the rise of self-employment as well, and precarious contracts in all kinds of ways in various countries. I think, thinking about working hours per week is probably more helpful there if we want to really enact legislative change.
So next question, Emilia.
Emilia, thank you so much. Thank you so much for presentation. I'm researching mainly on universal basic income. However, I touched upon a 4-day work week quite a bit. And I just have one question, which is quite behavioral, I would say. I wanted to ask you, so obviously Keynes predicted that by 2030, we would be working around 15 hours per week. And companies like Tatiana mentioned, like Ford companies, reduced working hours, expecting that it's going to free up our time and give us more leisure. However, it seems like that people these days work more than ever before, because unpaid overtime is at record high. So let's say remote workers in UK work around 6 to 10 hours more extra per week, and multi-job holdings has grown as well sharply. So my question is just, why do you think the paradox is there? Why do people, even though they do not technically need, but they do work even more? And do you think this is just a behavioral aspect to it that we should be looking into?
I can maybe jump in here, and then Joe can complement. Yeah, thank you for this question. We get this a lot, and especially sometimes when we work even directly with organizations where there is this option of working longer hours, which are then paid. People say that back to us, right? But people want to work more. What they want is to work more. They're not looking to work less. However, when you look at numbers, working shorter working hours is incredibly popular in all countries, really. So we're looking at numbers like 70, 80% of the population in most countries is in favor of a reduction in working time. And we know people are burning out and not seeing their family and friends enough, etc., etc. So we know that there is a popular aspiration to shorter working hours. So there is really, you're completely right, a paradox there. I think from my perspective, what really matters here is the structural conditions in which people are relating to their working time. So So one thing that is, interesting, for example, in the context of France, where I'm from, which I know quite well, when fixed-term contracts were introduced, they were introduced at a time of high employment, where actually workers were then in a good position to bargain with employers. So it was giving workers more freedom to basically decide on their working conditions, decide on their working time in situations where they were likely to get good jobs and they were in a position where they could bargain with their bosses. This is not the case today. We have high unemployment. The cost of living crisis is sweeping through Europe and it's not going down. And so people are really not in the same situation. In a lot of cases, I think looking for longer hours, at least in cases that I've seen firsthand, is because those hours are paid over time. And so people just need the money. So the fact that people cannot afford, and I don't remember exactly the numbers, but I think it's quite a lot, like maybe 15% or something of people who are in work live in poverty currently in Europe. This is something that is fairly new, right? That wasn't the case in the 70s or in the 80s when a lot of those regulations were introduced. So that's the first answer that I would give to this. I think it's impossible to look at this as an individual behavior without taking into account the effect of the structural conditions of the labor market that people are operating under.
Thank you.
Joe, do you want to add something?
This is another question. I guess the only thing to add is that, I think it's relatively new that shorter working week, 4-day working week, flexible working, all these different versions of work. It's fairly new that there's been big conversations across the world about these. I think we have to accept that, we're coming from decades and decades of the kind of 5-day working week and working really hard, being so ingrained, working really hard all the time, being so ingrained in our culture from a kind of behavioral perspective. I think we're starting to unravel that, but we're only in a way at the beginning of doing that. I think the conversation is starting to change. And you definitely see that from a generational perspective. It is the younger generations who are much more, they're going into the workplace demanding these kind of things in a way that, their parents' generations never did. And there is that sense that the younger generations don't want their working life to be as it was for their parents' generation or their grandparents' generations. They want that to change. So it will take time, but I think, it is, particularly in England, it's very ingrained, this kind of badge of honor culture of working hard all the time. It's fine to work hard sometimes. You don't need to work hard all the time. Why does that need to be something that you're proud about? And I think we're starting to see that changing, but it's coming from a place where that has been so ingrained for such a long time.
So I think this is where my following question is coming from, which generation does support 4-day work week more? Is it the youth that actually is drawn and take it naturally more, or did you observe any maybe an age group or yes, that are more drawn into this idea? Because I grew up in Eastern Europe where, for example, ideas like universal basic income, 4-day work weeks are taken as a drastic ideas. So it's very hard to talk, especially with older generation, about this. However, I experienced that younger generations are more open to the ideas and they take it as something that actually can at some point be implemented.
I think that's true generally, but the support is actually across all the workforce. So in the polls that I've seen, again, mainly in France and in the UK, but I think to be verified, but I think that's true. That's true in many countries. But it's mainly across the workforce, and the people who are less in favor are the people who are retired, which you can kind of see why, just in terms of, well, I didn't get it. But obviously, other elements that come into play, I think, when it comes to particularly how younger people relate to their jobs and to the labor market, is also that the trade-off for them is not exactly the same. So taking into account the ecological crisis, the environmental crisis, and the fact that they're seeing the world sort of burn, before their eyes, but also the fact that, retirement age is becoming later and later. The salaries are not as good in terms of spending power at all as what the previous generations had. When you look at, the housing market, younger people are not able to buy their home in the same way that previous generations were, for example. So all of these elements, I think, also really come into play in terms of how much they're willing to give to an employer in exchange for living conditions that are actually deteriorating.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, so we are running out of time. So very briefly, Michelle, let's make the last question and we'll...
Hello. It's really a quick one. I was really intrigued by the question that Joe asked about which company will be the new Ford of the 21st century. I was wondering if you have any candidates in mind. The only one I could think of is in France. There's LDLC, which is kind of a small Amazon-like online tech company that has 1,000 workers and that switched with a 4-day week in 2021. But if you have other ones like priority targets, would be interesting.
I mean, I would love it if a kind of, a modern day Google or someone like that was the company that kind of took this up. One of the companies that's really defining themselves as the future of work. Maybe it's one of the big tech or AI companies. I'm not sure. I mean, it's interesting that OpenAI, who you'll all know, who own ChatGPT. It was interesting that their policy platform, and there's obviously problems with ChatGPT and OpenAI, but their policy program, which they released a couple of weeks ago, was calling for companies to begin trialing a kind of 4-day, 32-hour working week. So there's clearly, gains to be made there. I mean, we know that in our experience conversation we've had that a lot of the big companies, this has been something they've been thinking about. It has been big enough that they've had to think about this, but they still remain on the fence. So I'm not sure what it's going to take to get that to change, but I'm sure it will change one day soon.
Tatiana, do you want to add something or should we close?
No, yeah, I think we can. I mean, Microsoft was one of the first companies to trial it, right? Obviously, but yeah.
True. Okay, so thank you very much, everyone, for attending this webinar. Really interesting ideas to reflect on. So I think the most important one, what Tatiana actually mentioned at the beginning, that this Ford milestone of the 40 week was not just a thing of organized business, but also of a struggle of the workforce, and also policy played an important part. So we need all these actors to come together and to work together in the same direction for actually very long periods of time, actually, if you look in historical terms. So we'll keep doing that. Just before ending, also remind you that we have our next webinar coming out in the 24th of June. You have it in the chat. We will have actually Michel Cernac, who actually made the last question, and he will talk about the Loi de Rouen, which is a very unknown piece of legislation that promoted the 40-week on 400 companies in France. So very interesting to know about that, and move a little bit on the context that always is focused normally on the UK or on the US. So it will be very interesting to move to France and know a bit more about this experience. So thank you, everyone. Have a nice day and see you in the next webinar. Bye.